I'm Rachel Morrison, 52 years old, and 3 months ago, I watched 27 years of building my reputation as one of the most trusted environmental consultants in the Pacific Northwest get shredded in a boardroom by people who knew I was telling the truth. But what Cascade Environmental Solutions did to cover up their illegal dumping operation and destroy my career was even worse. If you've ever had your professional integrity questioned when you were doing the right thing, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this kind of corporate betrayal. You know what's funny about environmental consulting? Most people think we're tree huggers with clipboards. But the reality is we're the ones standing between billion-dollar corporations and the communities they could poison for profit. I didn't start out thinking I'd be David fighting Goliath. I started because I wanted to understand why the creek behind my childhood home in Spokane turned orange one summer when I was 12. My grandmother, who raised me after my parents died in a car accident, used to say that water tells the truth about everything upstream. She was right about more than just water. I got into environmental science at Washington State University in the early 90s, back when companies were just starting to pretend they cared about sustainability. My professors talked about the new era of corporate environmental responsibility, and I believed them. I was young, idealistic, and convinced I could change the world one soil sample at a time. My first internship was with a small consulting firm in Seattle called EcoPath Analytics, where I learned that environmental work wasn't just about science. It was about politics, money, and the uncomfortable truth that some people would rather hide pollution than clean it up. Dr. Sarah Chen, my mentor at EcoPath, taught me that documentation was everything in our field. Rachel, she'd say, while we reviewed groundwater contamination reports, the Earth doesn't lie, but people do. Your job is to make sure the Earth's story gets told accurately. She showed me how to read between the lines of corporate environmental impact statements, how to spot data that had been massaged or conveniently omitted. Sarah had this way of making complex hydrogeology sound like detective work, and I was hooked. When a lumber company tried to hide selenium contamination in their mill pond by diluting their water samples, Sarah and I caught them red-handed with independent testing. That case taught me that environmental consulting wasn't just about measuring pollution, it was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. After graduating with my master's in environmental engineering, I spent my 20s bouncing between consulting firms, learning different specialties. I did air quality monitoring for Boeing, groundwater remediation for the EPA, and hazardous waste site assessments for King County. Each job taught me something new about how environmental damage happens and how companies try to minimize their liability. I learned to read the subtle language of environmental reports, where elevated levels meant dangerous and within acceptable parameters often meant barely legal. I learned that the most contaminated sites were almost always in poor neighborhoods, and that cleanup standards mysteriously became more flexible when the polluter had good lawyers. By my early 30s, I'd built a reputation for thoroughness and honesty that made me valuable to both regulatory agencies and private companies. I wasn't the consultant you hired if you wanted your problems to disappear. I was the one you hired if you wanted to know the truth about your environmental impact. That's how I ended up at Cascade Environmental Solutions in 2010. They were a mid-sized firm based in Portland that specialized in environmental compliance for timber, mining, and manufacturing companies across the Pacific Northwest. The salary was good, the benefits were excellent, and they promised me the independence to run my own projects. Most importantly, they had contracts with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality and the EPA, which meant I'd be doing work that actually mattered. The first decade at Cascade was everything I'd hoped for. I led remediation projects at old gas stations, assessed contamination at former dry cleaners, and helped small manufacturers understand their environmental obligations. I loved the fieldwork, putting on steel-toed boots and hard hats, collecting soil samples from industrial sites, testing groundwater wells in forgotten corners of industrial districts. There's something satisfying about understanding contamination at the molecular level, tracking how pollutants move through soil and water, predicting where they'll show up next. I felt like I was solving puzzles that protected public health. My specialty became legacy contamination sites, places where environmental damage from decades past was finally getting cleaned up. I worked on former lumber mills where wood preservatives had soaked into the ground, old mining sites where heavy metals had leached into streams, and chemical plants where solvents had created underground plumes of contamination. These weren't sexy projects, but they were important. Every site I helped clean up was a neighborhood where kids could play safely, where drinking water would stay clean, where families wouldn't have to worry about what was buried beneath their feet. The recognition started small but built steadily. In 2015, I received the Pacific Northwest Environmental Professional Award for my work on the Willamette River industrial cleanup. In 2017, the Oregon Environmental Council honored me for excellence in environmental protection. By 2020, I was being invited to speak at conferences, training new environmental professionals, and consulting on policy development for state environmental agencies. I'd published research papers on groundwater contamination modeling and innovative remediation techniques. My work was being cited by other environmental professionals, and I was proud of the career I'd built on scientific integrity and genuine care for environmental protection. The golden period of my career was probably 2018 to 2021. I was managing Cascade's largest contracts, mentoring junior staff, and serving on the board of the Oregon Association of Environmental Professionals. I felt like I'd found my place in the world, respected by my peers, valued by my employer, and making a real difference in environmental protection. I'd bought a small house in the Alberta Arts District, adopted 2 rescue dogs, and finally felt financially secure after decades of building my career. I was exactly where I wanted to be professionally, doing work that mattered with people who shared my values. But looking back, I can see the warning signs I missed. Cascade had been acquired by Meridian Corporate Services in 2019, a larger consulting conglomerate based in Texas that specialized in helping companies navigate environmental regulations. The new management talked about efficiency improvements and maximizing client value, which sounded reasonable enough. They brought in new policies about client communication protocols and project cost management. The changes seemed minor at first: new approval procedures for certain types of reports, requirements to copy additional managers on client emails, standardized language for environmental assessments that sounded more corporate and less scientific. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday in September 2023. I grabbed my usual coffee from Stumptown on my way to the office, reviewed my schedule during the 10-minute drive to Cascade's building in the Pearl District, and was looking forward to a site visit at an old electronics manufacturing facility in Hillsboro. I'd been working on the contamination assessment there for 6 months, and we were finally getting to the bottom of what looked like significant groundwater contamination from industrial solvents. The client, Precision Electronics Northwest, had been cooperative throughout the investigation, and I was preparing the final report that would determine the scope of their cleanup obligations. I'd been with Cascade Environmental Solutions for 13 years by then, working my way up from project scientist to senior environmental consultant to team leader managing some of our biggest contracts. The company had changed hands twice during my tenure, but the core mission remained the same: providing honest environmental consulting services to help companies comply with regulations and clean up contamination. At least, that's what I thought our mission was. The office that morning had the usual energy of a busy consulting firm. Project managers were reviewing schedules, junior staff were preparing for fieldwork, and account managers were on calls with clients. Our office occupied 2 floors of a converted warehouse with an open workspace on the first floor and private offices for senior staff on the second floor. The walls were decorated with maps of our project sites, framed environmental permits, and awards from various professional organizations. It felt like a place where serious environmental work got done. I'd built strong relationships with most of my colleagues over the years. There was Marcus Williams, our lab director, who could identify contamination patterns that others missed and had taught me to trust my instincts when something didn't look right in the data. Jennifer Park was our lead hydrologist, brilliant at modeling groundwater flow and always willing to double-check my calculations when I was working on complex contamination plumes. David Torres managed our regulatory compliance team and knew environmental law better than most attorneys. These weren't just colleagues. They were people I trusted with my professional reputation and who trusted me with theirs, but the company culture had been shifting since the Meridian acquisition. The new management team, led by Regional Director Paul Hendricks, seemed more focused on profit margins than environmental protection. They talked about client relationship management and optimizing project outcomes in ways that made me uncomfortable. Hendricks had a background in business development rather than environmental science, and he'd brought in several other managers with similar profiles. They weren't bad people, but they seemed to view environmental consulting as just another business, rather than a professional responsibility to protect public health. I should have paid more attention to the policy changes that had been implemented over the previous year. There was the new requirement that all client reports be reviewed by the business development team before being submitted. There was the directive to consider the client's business objectives when making recommendations about cleanup standards. There was the subtle but persistent message that retaining clients was just as important as providing accurate environmental assessments. These changes were presented as improving our client service, but they represented a fundamental shift in how Cascade approached environmental consulting. The red flag I missed completely was the conversation I'd overheard between Hendricks and Marcus in the break room 3 weeks earlier. They were discussing the precision electronics project, and Hendricks was asking whether there were alternative interpretations of the groundwater data that might reduce the client's cleanup costs. Marcus had pushed back, explaining that the contamination was clearly documented and required immediate attention. Hendricks had responded that perhaps we needed to think more creatively about regulatory compliance strategies. At the time, I'd dismissed it as typical corporate speak, but I should have recognized it as evidence that Cascade's priorities were changing in dangerous ways. The day everything changed started with an email from Jennifer asking me to review the draft groundwater contamination report for Precision Electronics. We'd been collaborating on this project for months, and I was expecting to see the comprehensive documentation of TCE and benzene contamination that we'd discovered during our site investigation. Instead, I found a report that minimized the contamination levels, suggested that natural attenuation would be sufficient for cleanup, and recommended minimal monitoring rather than active remediation. The data was the same, but the interpretation and recommendations had been completely altered. I walked over to Jennifer's desk to ask about the changes, and I could see immediately that something was wrong. She looked uncomfortable and kept glancing toward the management offices upstairs. "Rachel," she said quietly, "I need to show you something." She pulled up the original draft report on her computer, the one that accurately described the extent of contamination and recommended comprehensive remediation. Then she showed me the email chain where business development had requested revisions to align with client expectations, and management had instructed her to reconsider the necessity of extensive cleanup measures. The contamination at the Precision Electronics site wasn't minor. We documented TCE levels up to 150 times the EPA's maximum contaminant level in groundwater, with the contamination plume extending toward a residential neighborhood. We'd found benzene contamination in soil that posed vapor intrusion risks to nearby buildings. This wasn't a case where cleanup standards were ambiguous. This was a site that required immediate and comprehensive remediation to protect public health. The original report had been thorough, accurate, and scientifically sound. The revised version was a whitewash that would allow dangerous contamination to persist. I spent the rest of that morning reviewing the data again, hoping I'd missed something that would explain the discrepancy. I checked and rechecked the lab results, reviewed the hydrogeological modeling, and consulted the EPA guidance documents for sites with similar contamination. There was no ambiguity. The site posed significant risks to groundwater and nearby residents, and anything less than comprehensive remediation would be inadequate to protect public health. The revised report wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. When I went to Jennifer with my concerns, she confirmed what I already knew. "Rachel, I pushed back on every single change they requested. I explained that the contamination levels required immediate action and that delaying cleanup could put people at risk. But Paul said that our job was to provide balanced assessments that considered both environmental protection and client business needs. He said we needed to be more solution-oriented and less alarmist in our recommendations." That's when I realized that Cascade Environmental Solutions was no longer the company I joined 13 years earlier. The acquisition by Meridian had fundamentally changed our mission from protecting environmental and public health to protecting client interests. They weren't asking us to falsify data, but they were asking us to interpret accurate data in ways that minimized client liability, even when that interpretation put public health at risk. They were asking us to be consultants who helped companies avoid environmental responsibility rather than professionals who ensured environmental protection. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure what. My first instinct was to talk to Marcus, who had more experience dealing with management pressure and might have advice about how to handle the situation. When I found him in the lab that afternoon, he was clearly expecting our conversation. "You've seen the Precision Electronics report," he said before I could even explain why I was there. I nodded, and he closed the lab door behind us. "Rachel, this isn't the first time this has happened. Over the past 6 months, I've seen a pattern of reports being revised to minimize contamination findings and reduce recommended cleanup measures. The Dover chemical site, the Burlington manufacturing facility, the old gas station on McLaughlin. Every single report has been adjusted to align with what clients want to hear rather than what the science actually shows. Marcus pulled out a folder with copies of original reports and their revised versions. The pattern was unmistakable and deeply troubling. "Have you talked to anyone about this?" I asked. Marcus shook his head. "I brought it up with Paul during my last performance review, and he made it clear that my job was to provide technical analysis, not to question business decisions. He said that environmental consulting was evolving and that we needed to be more client-focused in our approach. When I pointed out that we have professional obligations to protect public health, he said that was something the regulatory agencies would handle, and that our job was to help clients navigate the regulatory process as efficiently as possible." That evening, I went home and did something I'd never done before in my career. I researched my own company's environmental reports online. What I found made me sick to my stomach. Cascade had been submitting environmental assessments to state and federal agencies that consistently minimized contamination findings and recommended minimal cleanup measures. Sites that should have required comprehensive remediation were being managed with monitoring-only approaches. Contamination plumes that posed risks to drinking water wells were being described as stable and not requiring immediate action. The most disturbing discovery was a memo I found in our shared project files from Paul Hendricks to the entire consulting staff. The memo, dated just 2 months earlier, outlined new client relationship standards that included considering client business objectives in all environmental recommendations and avoiding unnecessarily alarmist language in technical reports. The memo specifically instructed staff to focus on manageable solutions rather than comprehensive remediation, and to emphasize natural attenuation and monitored natural recovery wherever scientifically defensible. I realized that Cascade Environmental Solutions had become exactly the kind of consulting firm that I'd spent my career trying not to work for. A company that prioritized client satisfaction over environmental protection, that helped polluters minimize their cleanup obligations rather than ensuring that contamination was properly addressed. I built my career on scientific integrity and genuine commitment to environmental protection, and now I was working for a company that was systematically undermining those values. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Paul Hendricks to discuss my concerns about the precision electronics report and the broader pattern of report modifications I'd discovered. Paul's office was on the second floor, with windows overlooking the Willamette River and walls covered with corporate achievement awards and photos from company retreat events. He was a tall man in his mid-50s who dressed in expensive suits and spoke in the careful language of corporate management. He'd been with Meridian for 8 years before being assigned to oversee Cascade's operations, and he clearly saw environmental consulting as just another business vertical rather than a profession with ethical obligations. "Rachel, I'm glad you came to me with your concerns," Paul said after I'd explained my problems with the revised precision electronics report. "I think there may be some misunderstanding about our role as environmental consultants and our obligations to our clients." He leaned back in his leather chair and adopted the patient tone that managers use when they're about to explain why you're wrong to question their decisions. "Our job isn't to be environmental advocates or to impose unnecessary cleanup costs on our clients," Paul continued. "Our job is to provide accurate technical analysis and help our clients understand their regulatory obligations." The revised precision electronics report does exactly that. It presents the data accurately and recommends a cost-effective approach to addressing the contamination that meets all regulatory requirements. He paused and looked directly at me. "Rachel, I know you care deeply about environmental protection, and that's one of the things that makes you valuable to this company. But we also need to remember that our clients are businesses with legitimate financial constraints, and our recommendations need to be practical and achievable." I explained that the contamination at the precision electronics site posed significant risks to groundwater and nearby residents, and that monitoring-only approaches would be inadequate to protect public health. I showed him the data demonstrating TCE levels that exceeded drinking water standards by more than 100 times, and I explained that the contamination plume was moving toward residential areas with private wells. I pointed out that Oregon environmental regulations required immediate action for this type of contamination, and that our original recommendations had been consistent with standard professional practice for similar sites. Paul listened patiently and then explained that environmental regulations often allowed for flexible implementation approaches, and that our job was to help clients find creative compliance strategies that met regulatory requirements while minimizing business impact. He said that monitoring-only approaches were increasingly accepted by regulatory agencies as long as they were properly designed and implemented. He argued that comprehensive remediation wasn't always necessary and that we needed to avoid over-engineering our environmental solutions. Rachel, I need you to understand that Cascade's success depends on maintaining strong client relationships, Paul said in a tone that was becoming less patient and more directive. Our clients trust us to provide practical solutions to environmental challenges, not to impose unnecessary costs or create unrealistic cleanup standards. The environmental consulting industry is becoming more competitive, and we need to differentiate ourselves by being more business-friendly in our approach. He paused again and looked at me seriously. I hope I can count on your support in moving the company in this direction. I left Paul's office feeling like I'd just been given an ultimatum disguised as a conversation. The message was clear. Either I could accept Cascade's new approach to environmental consulting, or I could find somewhere else to work. But what bothered me most wasn't the threat to my job. It was the realization that Paul genuinely seemed to believe that helping clients minimize their environmental obligations was a legitimate business strategy. He wasn't asking me to violate regulations directly, but he was asking me to interpret those regulations in ways that prioritized client interests over environmental protection. Over the next few weeks, I watched the pattern continue across multiple projects. Reports were routinely revised to minimize contamination findings, reduce cleanup recommendations, and emphasize cost-effective approaches that often meant doing as little as possible. Jennifer, Marcus, and David were all struggling with the same ethical conflicts I was facing, but none of us knew how to address the situation effectively. We were all experienced environmental professionals who understood our obligations to protect public health, but we were working for a company that seemed to view those obligations as obstacles to client satisfaction. The situation reached a breaking point when I received the final version of the Precision Electronics report. Despite my objections and the clear scientific evidence of significant contamination, Cascade had submitted a report to the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality that recommended monitoring-only remediation for a site that clearly required comprehensive cleanup. The report contained accurate data, but the interpretation and recommendations were so inadequate that they would leave dangerous contamination in place indefinitely. I realized that I had reached the moment every environmental professional hopes to avoid, the moment when you have to choose between your job and your professional integrity. I could either accept that Cascade was no longer the kind of company I could work for, or I could fight to change how the company approached environmental consulting. I'd spent 27 years building a career based on scientific honesty and commitment to environmental protection, and I wasn't going to throw that away to help polluters avoid their cleanup obligations. I spent that weekend researching my options and trying to figure out the best way to address what I'd discovered. I could quit and find another job, but that would mean abandoning the projects where my expertise was needed to protect public health. I could try to work within the system to change Cascade's approach, but it was clear that management was committed to their new business model. Or I could report what I'd discovered to the appropriate regulatory agencies and professional organizations, which would almost certainly mean the end of my career at Cascade, but might prevent environmental damage and protect communities that were at risk. The decision became easier when I found out that Precision Electronics had already begun construction of new manufacturing facilities based on Cascade's inadequate environmental assessment. They were building on land that we knew was contaminated with carcinogenic chemicals, and they were installing groundwater wells that would likely become contaminated within a few years. The revised environmental report that Cascade had submitted to regulatory agencies was being used to justify development that would put workers and nearby residents at risk. This wasn't just about professional ethics anymore. This was about preventing immediate harm to real people. I started documenting everything I could find about Cascade's pattern of minimizing environmental assessments and helping clients avoid cleanup obligations. I copied the original reports and their revised versions, saved email chains showing management pressure to alter technical findings, and documented specific instances where Cascade's recommendations were inadequate to protect public health. I also researched the regulatory framework for reporting environmental consulting fraud and the professional codes of conduct that govern our industry. What I discovered was that environmental consultants have clear legal and ethical obligations to provide accurate assessments and recommendations that protect public health, regardless of client preferences. The Oregon Board of Professional Engineers, the EPA, and the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality all have mechanisms for reporting professional misconduct, and all of them take seriously any attempts to manipulate environmental assessments for financial gain. I also learned that there are federal whistleblower protections for environmental professionals who report violations of environmental laws. The hardest part was realizing that I was probably going to lose my job and potentially face retaliation from Cascade and Meridian. Environmental consulting is a small industry, and companies like Meridian have significant influence over hiring decisions throughout the Pacific Northwest. Paul had made it clear that employees who didn't support the company's new direction would find their careers at Cascade Limited, and I had no reason to believe he was bluffing. But I also knew that if I didn't act, more sites like Precision Electronics would be inadequately assessed, and more communities would be put at risk. The last straw was an email I received from Paul on a Friday afternoon in October, 3 weeks after our meeting about the Precision Electronics report. The email outlined new performance standards for senior consultants that included client satisfaction metrics and business development contributions alongside technical competency requirements. The message was unmistakable. Environmental consultants at Cascade would be evaluated based on their ability to keep clients happy and generate new business, not on their ability to provide accurate environmental assessments and protect public health. That weekend, I made copies of all the documentation I'd gathered and prepared a comprehensive report outlining Cascade's pattern of environmental consulting fraud. I included the original and revised versions of reports for multiple projects, email chains showing management pressure to alter technical findings, and specific examples of how Cascade's inadequate recommendations were putting communities at risk. I also prepared a detailed analysis showing how Cascade's approach violated Oregon environmental regulations, EPA guidelines, and professional engineering standards. On Monday morning, I submitted my report to the Oregon Board of Professional Engineers, the EPA's Office of Inspector General, and the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. I also filed a complaint with the Oregon Association of Environmental Professionals and requested an investigation into Cascade's consulting practices. Each report included detailed documentation of environmental consulting fraud and specific examples of how public health was being put at risk by Cascade's inadequate environmental assessments. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By Tuesday afternoon, I had calls from investigators with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division, and the State Attorney General's office. Each agency wanted to review my documentation and interview me about my experiences at Cascade. I learned that my report had triggered existing investigations into environmental consulting fraud across the Pacific Northwest, and that Cascade was one of several companies being scrutinized for similar practices. Paul Hendricks called me into his office Wednesday morning, and I could tell immediately that he knew what I'd done. "Rachel, I understand you've been in contact with some regulatory agencies about company business," he said in a tone that was barely controlling anger. "I need to remind you that you have confidentiality obligations to Cascade and to our clients, and that sharing proprietary information with external parties could have serious legal consequences." He paused and stared at me across his desk. "I also need to remind you that false accusations against your employer could constitute defamation and could damage your professional reputation permanently." I responded that I had reported violations of environmental law and professional standards to the appropriate regulatory agencies, which was both my legal obligation and my professional responsibility as a licensed environmental engineer. I explained that I had documentation showing that Cascade was systematically providing inadequate environmental assessments that put public health at risk, and that I had been careful to include only factual information in my reports to regulatory agencies. I also pointed out that environmental professionals have whistleblower protections when they report violations of environmental law. "Rachel, I think you've misunderstood both your obligations to this company and the nature of our environmental consulting practice," Paul replied. "What you call inadequate environmental assessments are actually examples of practical, cost-effective approaches to environmental compliance that meet all regulatory requirements while helping our clients maintain their business operations. You've taken a very narrow interpretation of environmental regulations and professional standards, and you've failed to consider the broader economic and social impacts of unnecessarily expensive cleanup requirements." The meeting ended with Paul informing me that I was being placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation into my breach of confidentiality and potential misconduct. He said that the company needed to protect itself and its clients from unsubstantiated allegations and potential defamation. I was instructed to clean out my office immediately and surrender my company laptop, access cards, and any other company property. I was also warned that I was prohibited from contacting clients, colleagues, or anyone else about company business during the investigation. Walking out of Cascade's office that Wednesday afternoon was one of the hardest things I'd ever done professionally. I'd spent 13 years building relationships with colleagues, developing expertise in environmental consulting, and establishing my reputation as a trusted professional in the industry. I was leaving behind projects I cared about, colleagues I respected, and a career I'd worked decades to build. But I was also leaving behind a company that had abandoned its commitment to environmental protection and professional integrity. The next several weeks were a blur of meetings with investigators, attorneys, and regulatory officials. The EPA's Criminal Investigation Division was building a case against Cascade and several other environmental consulting firms for systematically providing inadequate environmental assessments that violated federal environmental laws. The Oregon Department of Environmental Quality was reviewing every environmental report that Cascade had submitted over the previous 2 years, and they were finding a pattern of assessments that minimized contamination findings and recommended inadequate cleanup measures. The investigation expanded rapidly as other environmental professionals came forward with similar experiences at consulting firms throughout the region. It turned out that the kind of pressure I'd experienced at Cascade was becoming common throughout the industry, as larger corporate consulting companies acquired smaller environmental firms and imposed business development priorities that conflicted with environmental protection obligations. The EPA estimated that environmental consulting fraud was affecting cleanup decisions at hundreds of contaminated sites across the Pacific Northwest. Marcus Williams was the first of my former colleagues to contact me after I'd been placed on administrative leave. He called me at home on a Thursday evening and said he needed to tell me something important. "Rachel, after you left, Paul called a meeting with all the senior staff and basically said that anyone who had been in contact with you could face termination for breach of confidentiality. But he also said something that made me realize how serious this situation really is." Marcus paused, and I could hear the stress in his voice. He said that the company's attorneys had advised him that environmental consulting fraud was a federal crime, and that anyone who had participated in preparing misleading environmental reports could face personal criminal liability. That's when I realized that Cascade's management understood exactly what they were doing when they pressured environmental professionals to minimize contamination findings and reduce cleanup recommendations. They knew they were asking us to violate environmental laws and professional standards, and they knew that individual consultants could face criminal charges for environmental consulting fraud. They had been willing to put their employees at legal risk in order to maintain client relationships and maximize profits. Jennifer Park contacted me the following week to let me know that she'd also been placed on administrative leave after refusing to sign a revised environmental report that she believed was scientifically inaccurate. David Torres had been transferred to a different division after questioning management decisions about regulatory compliance strategies. It was becoming clear that Cascade was systematically removing any environmental professionals who wouldn't participate in their consulting fraud scheme. The breaking point came when I received a call from Dr. Sarah Chen, my mentor from my early days at EcoPath Analytics. Sarah was now working as an independent consultant and had been hired by the EPA to review environmental consulting practices at firms throughout the Pacific Northwest. "Rachel," she said, "I need you to know that your reports to the regulatory agencies have opened up something much bigger than just problems at Cascade. We're finding evidence of environmental consulting fraud at more than a dozen firms across Oregon and Washington, and it looks like it's being coordinated by the corporate consulting companies that have been acquiring smaller environmental firms." Sarah explained that the EPA's investigation had uncovered email communications between Meridian Corporate Services and other consulting conglomerates, outlining strategies for optimizing client outcomes and minimizing remediation costs that clearly violated environmental laws and professional standards. The investigation had also found evidence that these companies were sharing information about problematic environmental professionals who refused to participate in consulting fraud and were coordinating efforts to limit employment opportunities for whistleblowers. "Rachel, what you did was incredibly brave, and it's going to protect a lot of communities from environmental contamination," Sarah continued. "But I also need to warn you that this investigation is going to get much bigger before it's over, and the companies involved are going to fight back hard. They have a lot of money and a lot of lawyers, and they're going to try to discredit anyone who testifies against them." She paused and her voice became more serious. "You need to make sure you have good legal representation, and you need to be prepared for this to affect your career for a long time." 2 months after I'd been placed on administrative leave, I received a certified letter from Cascade Environmental Solutions, informing me that I was being terminated for breach of confidentiality insubordination, and conduct detrimental to the company's business interests. The letter also informed me that the company was considering legal action against me for defamation and interference with client relationships, and that they were disputing my eligibility for unemployment benefits based on my misconduct as an employee. The letter was clearly designed to intimidate me and discourage me from continuing to cooperate with the regulatory investigations. It contained veiled threats about my professional reputation and future employment prospects, and it suggested that my reports to regulatory agencies had been motivated by personal grievances rather than genuine concerns about environmental protection. The letter also included a settlement offer. If I agreed to retract my reports to regulatory agencies and sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, Cascade would provide me with a generous severance package and positive employment references. I showed the letter to the attorney who was representing me in the EPA investigation, and she explained that it was a classic intimidation tactic used by companies trying to silence whistleblowers. Rachel, they're scared because they know your documentation is accurate, and they know the regulatory agencies are taking your reports seriously, she explained. They're hoping they can pressure you into backing down before the investigation gets to the point where criminal charges are filed. She recommended that I reject the settlement offer and continue cooperating with the investigation. The months that followed were the most difficult period of my professional life. I was unemployed for the first time since college. I was facing potential legal action from my former employer, and I was watching my reputation in the environmental consulting industry get systematically attacked by people who wanted to discredit my testimony. Cascade and Meridian hired public relations firms to spread stories about disgruntled employees, making false accusations against reputable environmental consulting companies. They questioned my professional competence, my mental stability, and my motivations for reporting environmental consulting fraud. But the investigation continued to expand and gather momentum. The EPA's Criminal Investigation Division had obtained search warrants for Cascade's offices and had seized thousands of documents showing systematic environmental consulting fraud. The Oregon Department of Environmental Quality had suspended Cascade's environmental consulting licenses pending resolution of the investigation. The Oregon Board of Professional Engineers had opened disciplinary proceedings against multiple Cascade employees for violations of professional engineering standards. Most importantly, the investigation had uncovered evidence that communities throughout the Pacific Northwest had been put at risk by inadequate environmental assessments and cleanup recommendations. The precision electronics site that had triggered my initial report was found to have contamination levels that were even higher than our original assessment had indicated, and the company was ordered to halt construction and begin immediate remediation. Similar problems were found at dozens of other sites where Cascade and other consulting firms had provided inadequate environmental assessments. The vindication came on a Thursday morning in March, almost 6 months after I'd first reported Cascade's environmental consulting fraud to regulatory agencies. I received a call from the EPA's lead investigator informing me that federal criminal charges were being filed against Cascade Environmental Solutions, Meridian Corporate Services, and 12 individual employees for conspiracy to violate environmental laws, environmental consulting fraud, and obstruction of regulatory investigations. The charges were announced at a press conference led by the U.S. Attorney for the District of Oregon, with representatives from the EPA, the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and the Oregon Attorney General's Office. Attorney explained that the investigation had uncovered a systematic scheme to defraud environmental regulatory agencies and endanger public health by providing knowingly inadequate environmental assessments and cleanup recommendations. She said that the scheme had affected environmental decision-making at more than 200 contaminated sites across Oregon and Washington and had put thousands of people at risk from unaddressed environmental contamination. The press conference included specific details about the precision electronics case that I had initially reported, and the U.S. Attorney credited my whistleblowing with preventing immediate harm to public health and exposing a widespread pattern of environmental consulting fraud. She explained that the investigation had found evidence that Cascade and Meridian had systematically pressured environmental professionals to minimize contamination findings, reduce cleanup recommendations, and prioritize client financial interests over public health protection. Paul Hendricks was arrested at his home that morning and charged with conspiracy to violate environmental laws, environmental consulting fraud, and obstruction of justice. The charges carried potential sentences of up to 10 years in federal prison and fines of up to $500,000. Several other Cascade managers were also arrested, along with executives from Meridian Corporate Services and managers from other consulting firms that had participated in the scheme. The day of the arrests was simultaneously the most satisfying and most exhausting day of my professional life. I felt vindicated, knowing that the regulatory agencies had taken my reports seriously and had confirmed that Cascade was systematically violating environmental laws and putting communities at risk. I felt proud that my decision to report environmental consulting fraud had led to criminal charges against the people responsible and would prevent future environmental damage. But I also felt emotionally drained from 6 months of legal battles, unemployment, and attacks on my professional reputation. The media coverage of the arrests was extensive and largely supportive of the environmental professionals who had reported the consulting fraud. The Oregonian ran a front-page story about environmental consulting fraud that included quotes from me and other whistleblowers about the pressure we'd faced to minimize contamination findings and reduce cleanup recommendations. The Seattle Times published an investigative series about corporate environmental consulting companies that prioritized profits over public health. Environmental trade publications ran editorials supporting stronger enforcement of professional standards and better protections for environmental professionals who report misconduct. But the personal cost of whistleblowing was substantial and lasted much longer than the investigation. I was unemployed for 8 months while the criminal investigation was ongoing, and during that time I found it nearly impossible to find work with other environmental consulting firms. The industry is small and interconnected, and word had spread that I was a troublemaker who had betrayed my employer by reporting them to regulatory agencies. Several potential employers told me directly that they couldn't hire someone who had been involved in such a high-profile legal case, regardless of whether I'd been in the right. The financial impact was severe. I burned through my savings paying for legal representation, health insurance, and basic living expenses during the months I was unemployed. I had to take out loans to cover my mortgage payments, and I came close to losing my house. The stress affected my health in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had trouble sleeping, lost weight, and developed anxiety symptoms that persisted long after the legal case was resolved. I'd never realized how much of my identity was tied to my professional reputation, and watching that reputation get attacked was emotionally devastating. The personal relationships were equally challenging. Some of my colleagues in the environmental consulting industry supported my decision to report Cascade's consulting fraud, but others viewed me as someone who had violated professional loyalty and damaged the industry's reputation. I lost friendships with people who believed I should have handled my concerns internally, rather than involving regulatory agencies. I also discovered that some people I'd considered friends were willing to distance themselves from me when my legal situation made them uncomfortable. But there were also unexpected sources of support. Environmental advocacy organizations reached out to thank me for protecting communities from contamination that could have caused serious health problems. Attorneys specializing in environmental law contacted me to discuss potential civil lawsuits against Cascade and Meridian on behalf of affected communities. Other environmental professionals who had faced similar ethical dilemmas shared their experiences and offered encouragement during the most difficult parts of the legal process. The turning point in my career recovery came when Dr. Sarah Chen recommended me for a position with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality as a senior environmental investigator. The state was expanding its environmental enforcement program in response to the consulting fraud investigation, and they needed experienced environmental professionals who understood how consulting fraud worked and how to detect it. The job involved investigating suspected violations of environmental laws, reviewing environmental consulting reports for accuracy, and working with the Attorney General's office on environmental enforcement cases. Working for the Oregon DEQ was different from environmental consulting in many ways, but it felt like a natural extension of the values that had driven my original decision to become an environmental professional. Instead of helping companies comply with environmental regulations, I was helping enforce those regulations to protect public health and environmental quality. Instead of balancing client interests with environmental protection, I was focused entirely on ensuring that environmental laws were followed and that contaminated sites were properly cleaned up. The new job also allowed me to use my experience with environmental consulting fraud to help other regulatory agencies identify similar problems. I trained environmental investigators in multiple states on how to recognize signs of consulting fraud, how to verify the accuracy of environmental reports, and how to build cases against consulting firms that were violating environmental laws. I worked with the EPA to develop new oversight procedures for environmental consulting firms, and I helped draft stronger professional standards for environmental consultants. 6 months after starting my job with the Oregon DEQ, I received news that Cascade Environmental Solutions had pled guilty to federal charges of environmental consulting fraud and had agreed to pay $12 million in fines and restitution. Paul Hendricks had been sentenced to 3 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $200,000 in fines. Meridian Corporate Services had pled guilty to conspiracy charges and agreed to pay $45 million in fines and to implement comprehensive reforms of their environmental consulting practices. More importantly, the investigation had led to cleanup orders for more than 150 contaminated sites where Cascade and other consulting firms had provided inadequate environmental assessments. The Precision Electronics site that had triggered my initial report was undergoing comprehensive remediation that would cost the company more than $8 million, but would eliminate contamination that posed serious risks to groundwater and nearby residents. Similar cleanup orders had been issued for dozens of other sites, and communities throughout the Pacific Northwest were being protected from environmental contamination that could have persisted for decades. The legal resolution brought a sense of closure, but it also raised broader questions about how the environmental consulting industry could prevent similar problems in the future. The corporate consulting companies that had acquired smaller environmental firms had created systematic incentives for consulting fraud by prioritizing client satisfaction and business development over environmental protection and professional integrity. They had pressured individual environmental professionals to violate their ethical obligations and legal responsibilities, and they had retaliated against employees who refused to participate in consulting fraud. 1 year after the criminal charges were announced, I was invited to speak at the annual conference of the Pacific Northwest Association of Environmental Professionals about my experience as an environmental whistleblower. It was the first time I'd spoken publicly about the case since the legal proceedings had concluded, and I was nervous about how my colleagues in the industry would respond to my presentation. The response was overwhelmingly positive and supportive. Environmental professionals throughout the region shared their own experiences with pressure to minimize contamination findings and reduce cleanup recommendations. Many of them said that my willingness to report consulting fraud had made it easier for them to resist similar pressure at their own companies. Several consulting firms had implemented new policies to protect environmental professionals who raised concerns about report accuracy, and professional organizations had strengthened their codes of conduct to make clear that client satisfaction could never take priority over environmental protection. But the most meaningful part of the speaking engagement was the opportunity to meet with environmental science students from universities throughout the Pacific Northwest. These students were just beginning their careers in environmental consulting, and they wanted to understand how to maintain their professional integrity while building successful careers in a competitive industry. I told them about the importance of documentation, the value of professional relationships based on mutual respect, and the responsibility that environmental professionals have to protect public health, even when that responsibility conflicts with business interests. The earth doesn't lie, but people do, I told them, repeating the lesson that Dr. Sarah Chen had taught me more than 20 years earlier. Your job as environmental professionals is to make sure the Earth's story gets told accurately, regardless of who would prefer a different story. That's not always easy, and it's not always popular, but it's always the right thing to do. I explained that environmental consulting is ultimately about protecting communities from contamination that could cause cancer, birth defects, and other serious health problems, and that no client relationship or business opportunity is worth compromising that mission. Today, 3 years after I first reported Cascade's environmental consulting fraud, I'm still working as a senior environmental investigator with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. I've been promoted twice and am now leading the state's Environmental Consulting Oversight Program, which reviews environmental reports for accuracy and investigates suspected consulting fraud. The work is challenging and meaningful, and it allows me to use my experience to protect other environmental professionals from the kind of pressure I faced at Cascade. The consulting fraud investigation led to permanent changes in how environmental consulting is regulated and overseen in Oregon and throughout the Pacific Northwest. Consulting firms are now required to implement stronger quality control procedures. Environmental professionals have better whistleblower protections, and regulatory agencies have more resources to verify the accuracy of environmental reports. The changes aren't perfect, but they've made it much harder for consulting firms to systematically provide inadequate environmental assessments without being detected and prosecuted. I've also become involved in training environmental professionals about professional ethics and the importance of maintaining scientific integrity, even under business pressure. I speak regularly at universities, professional conferences, and continuing education programs about the lessons learned from the consulting fraud investigation. The most important message I try to convey is that environmental professionals have clear legal and ethical obligations to protect public health, and that those obligations can never be compromised for business reasons. Looking back on the experience, I'm proud of the decision I made to report Cascade's environmental consulting fraud, even though it came at significant personal and professional cost. The investigation prevented environmental damage that could have affected thousands of people, led to cleanup of contaminated sites that had been inadequately assessed, and resulted in stronger oversight of environmental consulting practices. Most importantly, it sent a clear message that environmental professionals who prioritize client interests over public health will face serious legal consequences. But I also recognize that not every environmental professional is in a position to take the kind of risk I took when I reported consulting fraud. Whistleblowing can destroy careers, create financial hardship, and subject people to years of legal battles and personal attacks. The decision to report professional misconduct should never be taken lightly, and environmental professionals need better protections and support systems when they do make that decision. The environmental consulting industry has made progress in addressing the problems that led to the consulting fraud investigation, but significant challenges remain. Corporate consulting companies continue to acquire smaller environmental firms, and the pressure to prioritize client satisfaction over environmental protection hasn't disappeared. Environmental professionals still face ethical dilemmas when client expectations conflict with their professional obligations, and not all of them have the support they need to make the right choice. For environmental professionals who are facing similar ethical dilemmas, my advice is to document everything, build relationships with colleagues who share your values, and understand your legal and professional obligations before you're in a crisis situation. Keep copies of original reports and email chains showing any pressure to alter technical findings. Consult with attorneys who specialize in environmental law and whistleblower protection if you're concerned about potential retaliation. Most importantly, remember that your primary obligation is to protect public health and environmental quality, and that no business relationship is worth compromising that mission. If you're an environmental professional who has faced pressure to minimize contamination findings or reduce cleanup recommendations, please share your experience in the comments below. If you're a young professional just starting your career in environmental consulting, I'd love to hear about the ethical challenges you're facing and the support you need to maintain your professional integrity. And if you've been affected by environmental contamination that you believe was inadequately assessed or addressed, please know that there are environmental professionals working every day to prevent those problems and to hold polluters accountable for cleaning up their contamination. The fight for environmental protection and professional integrity is ongoing, and it requires the participation of environmental professionals throughout the industry. We can't prevent every instance of consulting fraud or environmental contamination, but we can make sure that those problems are detected quickly, reported appropriately, and addressed effectively. We can support colleagues who are facing ethical dilemmas, and we can create professional cultures that prioritize environmental protection over business development. Your career is important, but your integrity is irreplaceable. The communities we serve deserve environmental professionals who will tell the truth about contamination, even when that truth is inconvenient or expensive. The environment we're trying to protect needs advocates who will prioritize long-term environmental quality over short-term business interests. And the profession of environmental consulting needs practitioners who understand that our ultimate responsibility is to the public health and safety of the communities where we work. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe if you want to hear more stories about environmental protection and professional integrity. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've had similar experiences with workplace pressure to compromise your professional values. Together, we can build an environmental consulting industry that deserves the public trust and truly protects the communities we serve.